Climate change, firstly, is not a very sexy thing to talk about. It demands that we actually refocus our energies, our resources, and our money. What would that look like? It would look like doing away with coal-fired power plants as a first. And that already has so much opposition from government. They say it's going to cost too much, that we already have the systems in place for coal, and not really understanding the impact or even caring of the impact that it has on human rights. If you're saying that what matters is the economy and making sure that there's electricity, for example, that is done by people. And it's costing people's lives. It was detailed that there is an estimated 15,300 deaths that can be attributed to air pollution in high priority areas. That's 15,300 of the labor force of people that we're going to lose. So even from an economic perspective, you are losing 39.6 million rand of the health budget is used to treat illnesses that arise from air pollution as a result of burning coal. That's already money that's being taken out of the system that could be used on other things that would advance your economic endeavors. If we're inclined not to look at it from a human rights perspective, which I think is very important to do, and that's why we're here, and we want to look at it in an economic perspective, it still doesn't make sense.
All eyes are on us, and if we do this in a truly just way, we could actually set the scene and set the standard for the rest of the world. So the rest of the world could actually learn from us on what justice actually looks like.
Hi everyone, welcome to this Mobilize podcast. My name is David, and today I'm talking to some activists and researchers from Section 27 about their latest research report, Climate Change as a Human Rights Risk. With that said, I'm going to go straight over to our guests and allow them to introduce themselves. Mo, would you like to start?
Hello everyone, my name is Mateo Brody, and I am a candidate attorney at Section 27, working on our environmental and climate justice project.
Hi all, my name is Matshidiso Lengwasa, but you can call me Tsidi if you really know me. And I'm a budget researcher at Section 27, and just really interested and excited to talk about this report.
Hi everyone, my name is Kanyisa Mapipa. I'm the head of the Health Rights Program at Section 27, and I work with Mateo and Sidi on climate justice as well.
Thanks for coming through, everyone. So as I was saying, today we're talking about climate change as a human rights risk, which Section 27 has done this rather comprehensive 30-page report, really looking at the risks we face in South Africa with both our ongoing carbon economy, but also the transition into a low-carbon economy. With that said, I'm going to actually jump into the first question I'd like to ask today. And for that, I'm actually going to throw it right at Mo. So, Mo, through this research project, what was the main question you were looking to answer?
So, Section 27, as some might know, works on the right to basic education and the right to access to healthcare services in the main, right? And we've started an environmental and climate justice program, realizing that the climate crisis threatens these rights. And so this report, what this report aims to do really is to have a look at what the risks are, the climate risks on the health and education sector, so specifically in South Africa. And then also look at what the policy and sort of legislative regulations are that are in place to deal with this risk that is facing the health and education systems. So we're really looking at the impacts. We're looking at what international law says about climate change and climate justice, but we're looking also to center the fact that climate change is a human rights issue. And so the question really, not the question, but the aim really was to locate climate change as a human rights issue, and also look at what the vulnerabilities of the healthcare system and education system are in relation to climate change. The report, obviously, given that climate change is a broad issue affecting various aspects of our human systems, looks at different groupings and what their vulnerabilities are. That's what the report does. We've also looked at a budgeting aspect. How does, whether we're financing or budgeting appropriately to safeguard our systems against the climate change threat and risk.
Thanks for those details. And I can see you have some support in it. Something that came through to me, I was just wondering is, I know most listeners have an idea in their head of what human rights are. It's something we're talked about in school in South Africa. But I think having like a clear definition for what we mean about human rights in this case would be really, really helpful, considering it's the central part of this discussion. Would someone like to expand on that? Mo or Tsiri or Kanyisa?
Yeah, so when we speak about human rights, we're speaking about the impact on specific individuals as it relates to climate change and the experiences of the environment, as well as the experiences of accessing basic human rights and basic services. So, for example, is it harder for people to then access healthcare, access education, access housing as a result of the threat that climate change has on their livelihoods, on their ability to farm, their ability to go to school, their ability to access healthcare services? So that's what we mean. Is there an added burden on individuals' experiences of their lives as a result of the climate in which they live in?
Just to support that, I think it's also a good opportunity to talk a little bit about Section 27. I know Mo introduced it about that we do education and healthcare rights, but we're underpinned by the Constitution of the country, like all policy should be, and budget allocations and everything. And so when we look at when we talk about human rights, it's underpinned by the idea that everybody who is in the country has equal rights, the right to a name, the right to dignity, right to basic education and healthcare. So, now I think it's quite an opportune moment, like having this report come out, because we can now start the conversation around climate change is always done quite far removed from what does that actually mean to people now. And with the floods that happened in KZN in 2022 and in the Eastern Cape, it really just highlighted when schools were destroyed and healthcare facilities were destroyed, it just highlighted that actually this crisis is it's an ongoing crisis, and we need to foreground any responses that we have to that, to ensuring that even after this and after we have this just transition, even at the best case scenario, that people's constitutional rights are protected. So we're doing the work for today, but we're also doing it for future generations, ensuring that those rights, that those constitutional obligations, like the state is able to meet them way after if we deal with the crisis in the best case scenario.
Thanks, Kanyisa and Tsiri. I think what I'd really like to also encourage listeners to do, and we'll definitely have a link to Section 27's website, is to really look at some of the work Section 27's done over the last decade. And it's really impressive, particularly at highlighting unacceptable failures in our country. I remember when I was a younger activist, something that really resonated for me was the highlight put on Michael Kamape's story. And I think that's what this really brings to the next part of the discussion, which is, I don't know how much the international, even local community thinks about the impact of climate on just human rights, and how we talk about a just transition, and a transition is not automatically just. It's just if we make it so. So I guess the question then from me would be, what would you say is the degree of attention placed on human rights when transition is talked about, or isn't it really a central part of the current discourse?
I would say that it's not a central point of the discussion. Climate change, firstly, is not a very sexy thing to talk about. It's all doom and doomsday kind of stuff. The world is coming to an end kind of stuff. So for that reason, a lot of people don't want to talk about it. And then also, it demands that we actually refocus our energies, our resources, and our money, right? So, for example, in the South African context, what would that look like? It would look like doing away with coal-fired power plants as a first. And that already has so much opposition from government. They say it's going to cost too much, that we already have the systems in place for coal. As a country, we produce quite a lot of coal. They're quite set in their ways and not really understanding the impact or even caring of the impact that it has on human rights. So when they have these discussions, and we've seen, I mean, the recent IRP that was published in 2019 and then again in 2023, they did a socioeconomic impact assessment on that, and it had very little to do with access to education and access to healthcare and the impacts of climate change as a result of using coal for an extended period of time. The impact on those services. There was very little they addressed on those things. When we look at climate change, at the transition from how we are getting electricity right now as a country to where we want to be, there's very little consideration of what that will look like for the most vulnerable of our country. And not surprisingly, as you'll see in our report, we mention that the most devastating impact will be on the people that have contributed the least to creating the situation of climate change. And so there really should be more of a voice for them. There really should be more of a consideration of, the impact of that this will have on these people's lives when they have the least already in our society.
Go ahead, man.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I agree with Kanye regarding, the human rights impact not being central to this discussion when it actually needs to be. Largely, this issue has been sort of close to the environmental law, environmental rights sort of discussion. But we have seen quite a lot of developments in recent times from international human rights bodies like the Human Rights Council. We have seen who have released quite a few statements linking climate change and human rights. We've seen statements from the Committee on the Rights of the Child, or a general comment rather, general comment number 26, which really clarifies what governments must do to protect children's rights in relation to the threat of environmental degradation and climate change. I think on an international plane, we are seeing a lot of movement. We are seeing international organizations bringing these issues together because you can't have one conversation without having the other. But a lot more work still needs to be done to really reframe that conversation.
Yeah, I think that when you were talking, Kanisa, and you as well, Mo, about kind of what we need to observe. Or what we need to pay attention to in terms of vulnerable groups. It reminds me of some of the conversations we recently had. So we recently interviewed 3 political parties leading up to the election. We managed to interview the ANC, DA, and Rise Mzansi about their climate policies. Unfortunately, we did reach out to IFP and EFF as well, but they weren't available to be interviewed on it. And something that actually comes through in quite a lot of the discussions, and not just with them, but in general in the space, is when people talk about the impacts of climate change on people, it reminds me of sort of the all protocols observed. So you start like a public meeting and you're like, okay, all protocols observed, I recognize these people, I recognize this. And it's sort of, that's the discussion. So we have this very quick recognition that climate change is harmful. And then all we talk about is the economy usually. And I'm seeing your reaction there, Kanyisa, and I really want you to dive into that because the conversation you had about coal, it's really often all about money. This thing can be devastating. People gonna die. In almost like pushing it off to the side. And then, okay, let's talk about the economy. How do we not affect this? How do we build jobs? How do we do this growth? And not to say those things aren't important, but they certainly aren't centering human rights at all. Did you want to add something on to that, Kanisa?
Yeah, I think, the analysis on it is always flawed, right? Not just from a human rights perspective, but even from an economic perspective, it doesn't make sense. If you're saying that what matters is, the economy and making sure that there's electricity, for example, that, runs through businesses and the like, that is done by people. and it's costing people's lives. In a recent report, it was in a 2019 report, it was detailed that there was about 15,300, there is an estimated 15,300 deaths that can be attributed to air pollution in high priority areas if there isn't a transition into renewable energy by 2030. That's 15,300 of the labor force of people that we're going to lose. So even from an economic perspective, you are losing. On a monetary perspective, in another report that was done in Parliament, they estimated that 39.6 million rand of the health budget is used to treat illnesses that arise from air pollution as a result of burning coal. So that's already money that's being taken out of the system that could be used on other things that would advance your economic endeavors. So even from that perspective, we're running at a loss. So, if we're inclined not to look at it from a human rights perspective, which I think is very important to do, and that's why we're here, and we want to look at it an economic perspective, it still doesn't make sense.
I find that really fascinating, and particularly talking about, well, actually horrifying, not just fascinating, particularly talking about those 15,000 people. And it's a lot more than that, right? That's just a current study showing this group of people today that are effectively sacrificed so that Gauteng, Durban, and Cape Town can have all the electricity to run our economy. And when you're talking about the expenditure, you're talking about that health expenditure, but that doesn't count the unpaid expenses. It's often really a central part of one of the problems with a carbon-intensive economy is that we don't pay for the damages we're causing. We're not paying for the acid rain that's happening kilometers away from the coal power plant. We're not paying for the flood that happens on the other side of the planet because of the increased global temperatures. And I think that leads into a really central part of your report, which is this really close focus on different groups and particularly vulnerable groups. So that sort of leads me into asking you, Tsidi, another question. Bearing in mind how you really dived into the impact the climate crisis and potentially the transition is going to have on vulnerable groups, was there anything that really surprised you, or even if it didn't surprise you, stuck out to you in this report that you'd want to really highlight now?
If anything with this report, I think it's very comprehensive and just presents a very important argument and reflection on how the most marginalized people in the country bear the burden of the climate crisis. So while the climate crisis is going to affect everyone, it is, I think Kanye mentioned that the people who least contributed, who end up bearing the greatest burden, which is the same with all social crises. We live in a country and global society that is still racked with unequal gender norms, racial norms, class norms. It's just important information to see and just to see the studies that are compiling all the research that has been done to really highlight that while the continent, as a continent, I know it gets complicated with South Africa's carbon contributions, but as a continent, we produce less than 5% of the emissions globally, and we can already see when it comes to the impacts. It doesn't actually, theoretically shouldn't discriminate, but because we haven't invested adequately, especially since the end of apartheid, which would have been an opportunity to do that, to really build a more equitable society, we're still deeply unequal. There's still poverty, and our poverty reduction halted in 2011, and it's been downhill since. So we're seeing regression in that. And what that means is that because we haven't invested adequately in those communities, they end up bearing the burden. So more middle-class people can be oh, there's this crisis, it's raining, or there's a heat wave. We can put in air conditioning. I mean, these are just very cosmetic things. But for people who rely on state intervention, or for whom the reason why we give money through taxes or through debt, why we're incurring those things, are so that we can realize the rights to education, healthcare, and all these human rights for all people. But because we're failing those people, it just means that we now have a climate crisis where we, even if we do solve it and we invest all this money, but if we use the same way of thinking that we've been using right now, it will be a decarbonized economy, but then it will entrench that gender inequality, that racial inequality that continues to plague the nation that we live in, and also just globally, actually.
Tsidi has sort of answered that quite well. What we're seeing is that it's the already vulnerable that are going to be most impacted by the climate crisis. When we speak to children, for example, that's a group that's particularly vulnerable to the impact of climate change, right? We speak to mothers and children who are also impacted by for example, rising temperatures and what impact that has on their health. We look at the education perspective. What we're seeing is, in the work that we're doing around infrastructure, school infrastructure, we're seeing that there's schools that are underdeveloped, that with large amounts of backlogs in terms of fixing school infrastructure. Those schools, those same schools, and those same children that have been attending those dilapidated schools are more vulnerable to the impact of climate change, right? So if there's a severe weather event, it's those school infrastructure that's going to be mostly damaged. Really, what the climate crisis does is it compounds on those that are already quite vulnerable, and in different ways. The report speaks to it. We look at issues around food security and food insecurity. It's those that are economically disadvantaged. So yes, just to point out, to really underscore what Sidi was saying, it's the same groups of people that are currently disadvantaged that are going to suffer, that are already suffering from the impacts of climate change.
That really resonates with me, and there's some work we've been doing in our climate comms work over the last few months, where we've been talking to communities and working with our facilitators who run CBOs, and one of the stories which really came up, and Sidi, when you mentioned the air conditioner and you were talking more about the education side of things, so when we talk about like a 2.5 degrees Celsius global temperature increase, which is where we're headed, right, with the degree of change we're doing in society or mitigation we're doing, that doesn't mean a 2.5 degree temperature increase everywhere. In parts of Limpopo, that's going to mean like 5 degrees, which means you're talking about, let's say, this underdeveloped school for, let's say, early childhood development, or even just primary school, right? Suddenly these classrooms are probably going to go up to like 40 degrees Celsius. How do you learn maths in 40 degrees Celsius? How do you learn English in 40 degrees Celsius? How do you do any of your subjects in that temperature? And at that point, we get into a discussion where are air conditioners a luxury anymore? Or are air conditioners now directly linked to whether or not a kid can go to varsity, whether or not a kid can then get a job in the new economy? And when you're talking about vulnerable groups, that anecdote, that story resonated so much for me. On that front, do you have anything you want to expand upon that, Mo or Kanisa?
I was just going to speak about it from a health perspective as well, just the rising temperatures. So we did quite a bit of work with WITS RHI, who are currently doing research on the impact of the rising temperatures on maternal and child health. And they found in their report that the higher numbers of women giving birth, preterm births, going into labor early can be directly attributed to the higher temperatures that we're seeing. So even in a health perspective, we're seeing impacts as a result of the higher temperatures now, and how much more when we start seeing the real anticipated consequences of climate change. That same child who's having to sit in a classroom that's hot will suffer from heat stroke. They'll go to facilities that aren't equipped to deal with that, because that's not, the burden of disease in that area that, the facilities used to dealing with. It's really just stacking the odds against vulnerable groups to not deal with this and to not adapt and to mitigate where we can.
Yeah, and I think maybe to speak to that same point from an education perspective again, we highlight findings or research that's been done around the impact of heat on educational outcomes. And there's some research that's done that shows that there's dramatic decrease in the educational outcomes when you look at learners who study in hot temperatures versus learners who study in air-conditioned classrooms, for example, or in regions where the temperature isn't as hot. And this is why we need to look at how do we adapt our systems How do we ensure that in an area where the temperature, like a Limpopo, where it's not a 2-degree increase, it's perhaps a 5-degree increase, how are those learners, how's those learners' education protected, their right to education, how is that protected, and how do we ensure that they have the same level of education as their counterparts in other provinces in better resource schools, for example?
It's a good opportunity to just reflect that there are tools and resources available to halt this. So yes, it sounds like it's quite depressing, because it is. It's very concerning, but actually we have tools like fiscal policy redistribution, like the way that we fund, sending resources, like getting rid of all the pit latrines. That's one way to better position people in those areas, learners in those schools, even with pit latrines, like bacteria that's waterborne. There's a link between that and increasing temperatures. So something like that, there's overcrowding. If we can fund, actually create posts for teachers, if we can even just the investments in adaptation and mitigation, that the clinics, firstly, the infrastructure projects, we should be thinking about them from a perspective of not just ticking off okay, we need to allocate this much, let's just build this school, but also thinking about how will we be able to maintain that over the next, in a context, in that climate crisis context. And it is unfortunate that that's the voice that's missing. If you look at budget documents, it's very difficult to find climate change, for instance, in the document. So it just seems that the money side of things hasn't quite caught up to the decision making, which is a problem, because then it's also entrenching those inequalities. But that's one opportunity that if government wants to advance that and actually play a role in creating a society that redresses those inequalities, but also just better positions everyone to be able to react and deal with, the crisis. Then it no longer is that climate crisis. If they want to be part of the solution, that they can be looking at how do we foreground human rights in the way that we allocate funding for today, but also in future. That could be their legacy.
I think that way of looking at it is so critical, and what it sort of spurs me is thinking a bit about how South Africa is a very unique country in a sense, and it's to do with our inequality, right? South Africa is, by some definitions, the most unequal society in the world. But in that sense, it actually makes South Africa a microcosm of the globe. The difference is that they're still part of the same tax base, right? Is that the people that have unequally benefited in South Africa are paying into the same tax system. Whereas if we think of America or Europe as traditionally very high emitters, they aren't paying taxes into the same pool as all the people that are most vulnerable and suffering from it. Going on that story, or looking at that, I think it's really fascinating to look at, if you look at just the South African population, and if you look at electricity consumption, and you go and look at the northern suburbs in Joburg or the southern suburbs in Cape Town, and you're looking at 30 to 50 to 60 kilowatt hours a day consumption on kind of your more light energy consumption households, up to way more on very, very high consumption households. And then you go to a small village or you go to townships and you're talking about 5 kilowatt hours. So if we think of that, right, and we think of what is the responsibility that the households which are consuming all this electricity, and it's not just electricity, right, because carbon emissions are created when we consume products. So that car that I'm driving, the steel in that car, the aluminium in that car was made somewhere. And I don't maybe have that on my electricity bill, but that used coal-powered electricity to make. So if we look at a South African context, before even going globally, what you're talking about with the budget is how we actually do a form of restitution, where we say all these wealthier parts of South Africa have massively benefited from our emissions as a country, and now the wealthier parts need to subsidize or pay maybe a restitution in terms of making sure the development and the adaptation happens in these communities. So what you were saying, that really resonates with me. That's sort of the story I get under the surface. But I just want to sort of do a sense check. Is that sort of a lot of what you were seeing in this research in terms of what is needed from a budget standpoint?
Yeah, I think that's one of the aspects, is just changing the way that we look at the budget. I mean, we even seeing it now, the commentary about elections, a lot of it is rooted in market, and not reflections on human rights. I think we talk about it in the more economic space, that economics has been a little bit far removed from the democratic process. And so when we're thinking of climate change or we're thinking of social crises, it's quite difficult to sit back and think, oh, but actually there are tools that the state has to addressing this, and one of the most powerful tools is through how we tax, how we take on debt if we do take on it, and how we fund human rights in the country. And what you're mentioning also about the just transition, like this is an opportunity because South Africa is this microcosm, this unequal state, but all eyes are on us. And if we do this in a truly just way, we could actually set the scene and set the standard for the rest of the world. So the rest of the world could actually learn from us on what justice actually looks like. We might not have transitioned as well, like post-apartheid. There might have been those entrenched legacies of inequality that still plague us, but actually maybe this is an opportunity to actually like transition properly, like correct the mistakes of the past, but also just create a society where we can show the world actually like inequality. It's not great, but we can actually solve it. And one of those powerful ways that I keep saying that is that tool that we have is our fiscal policy.
It's such a big part of the discussion. And like you're saying, that the way the finances are often looked at the market, but they're not necessarily looked at, how will the market respond to this? How will private business respond? How will jobs be lost or gained? But I think this sort of goes into how, when people talk about the climate crisis, there is a lot of focus, and appropriately so, on mitigation. So for listeners that don't know, that's the stopping of climate change. That's the switching from coal to renewables. That's switching from oil-powered cars or diesel-powered cars and petrol-powered cars to electric cars, or anything we can do to stop carbon emissions. That's your mitigation. But a really big part of what you guys are looking at in this report is, what is the adaptation work we need to do? What do we need to do to make sure those kids in Limpopo don't go to a classroom in which they can't learn in, that they go to a classroom which they can learn in? How do we make sure that those individuals working in Mpumalanga to power our whole nation aren't left behind? And there is a massive financial implication to adaptation. Would you say, and I'm kind of thinking, Kanisa, you might be the person to answer this one, but would you say, or Mo, or CD, but yeah, let's start with Kanisa. Would you say there's been enough focus on adaptation in not just the local discourse, but the international discourse on the climate crisis?
Certainly not. I think the little bit of focus that there has been on climate change definitely hasn't looked into adaptation. We've focused on mitigation, how to curb our use of coal-fired power plants, for example, how to curb our use of non-renewables, and how to shift to renewable energies. The thing is that the impact of climate change is still going to be there. Whether we do all of this mitigation now and we reach our goals, we're still going to see the higher temperatures. We're still going to see, the emergence of diseases. We're still going to see the impact of climate change. What we need to also start doing is to then adapt to our systems to make sure that when those things happen, that the most vulnerable amongst us aren't unfairly burdened. So within the health system, for example, the Department of Health has published a document called the National Climate Change and Health Adaptation Plan, but they've done nothing with it. It lapsed in 2019. It hasn't been renewed, and nothing's been done to review the system in terms of the risks that are present in the system, in terms of what could happen if the system experiences, for example, a drought as a result of climate change, or floods as an example of climate change. And so what we say in our report is that there needs to be an intentional application of documents like that. And that's one thing that we know about South Africa, right, is that we've got great policies. We can develop documents like this, but we don't sit down and actually implement them, because we would be in a different position right now if this had been implemented. KZN would be in a different situation right now if this had been implemented. So we have all of these things, and we have the means, and as Didi has said, we have the finances to do it, but we're just not doing it, and we're kind of just waiting for everything to crumble. I mean, we have ideas on what that might look like, things that we as Section 27 are pushing for in the climate space, particularly in health and in education, on how the different departments can adapt their systems to meet climate change. Things such as health impact assessments, stress testing facilities to make sure that in the event of a flood or in the event of a drought, the facility can still stand and actually provide services to people. And those things are all things that are detailed in these documents that are just not being done. And so, as much as we are focusing and having our quarrels over the, IRPs and cancelling coal and all of that, we also need to do this part of the work so that we have a better defense for all South Africans and all people who live in South Africa against the impacts of climate change.
So I think when we speak of adaptation or climate change, generally the conversation sometimes becomes misplaced in that we speak about future events a lot, and it's things that are happening currently. I mean, this week there's floods that are affecting parts of KZN and the Eastern Cape. So adaptation becomes a priority for now, not even for the future. And Kanyisa has already spoken about where there has been policy from the National Health Department, it hasn't been implemented, it hasn't been adequately funded or budgeted for. In the education space, again, very little movement in terms of adaptation policies, even mapping out the risks that the system faces from climate change. So yeah, the climate change bill presents an important opportunity because it mandates, once it is signed by the president, it mandates government to formulate adaptation strategies and plans. And what this entails is essentially mapping out what the risks are, what risks do we face as a country from climate change. And then beyond that, sectorally, the different departments, the different sectors must look at what specific risks they face. And develop adaptation plans. And we're hoping it's going to be a lot more coordinated in terms of funding and allocation of budgets to enable these departments and to enable government to effectively implement adaptation plans and strategies which really protect human rights and our systems in South Africa. So yeah, definitely more needs to be done on the adaptation front. There's a lot that's going on the mitigation, which is very important, but adaptation is a current priority. It's not something we should be relegating to a future event that we need.
Thanks for that, Mo and Kanyisa. Adaptation is something we've really been trying to focus on over the last 6 months of work we've been doing in climate comms. And I think it is so integrally linked to human experiences and human rights. And this really leads into the next question I want to ask, and I want to direct this one at you, Tidi. If you look at the history of the Industrial Revolution, going back 200 years, there's this long history of what are called sacrifice zones. So where we have this coal mine, there's going to be this community which goes and mines the coal, brings it out the ground, sends it to the power plant or to the factory. And those people are going to develop lung diseases. They're going to die young. They're going to be crushed by massive mining equipment. And these people are effectively sacrificed for progress. And we don't often pay for that. So we've done a decent job of recognizing this is what's happened in the modern industrialized economy. We still don't necessarily pay restitution for it or cover it, but we recognize it. But now we're going through this transition, and we're going to put solar panels everywhere, and wind turbines, hydropower, and various forms of energy which aren't going to be damaging the planet in the same way. But fundamentally, we still need enormous amounts of resources for this. Huge amounts of copper, huge amounts of quartz, huge amounts of rare minerals. If we think of batteries and electric cars, those come from cobalt mines, where there are young children working in those mines in DRC. So I wanted to ask Mtidi, in this report, how does the report speak to sacrifice zones and how we need to avoid these if we really want a just transition, and how we go about avoiding sacrificing people and places for a sort of equitable transition.
Yeah, so I think the way the report entrenches this by reminding or highlighting who bears the burden of climate change and who it's affected by. I'm assuming, as someone who also then read the reports, I felt like after that just felt more inspired to just advance that activism, because it gives all the hardcore facts. Like, there are people who have done so much research, like we've done so much research, to just putting it down together to essentially say the thing that people have been saying for a long time, So I always mention this when I talk about like climate justice and stuff. But I grew up in Witbank, Emalahleni, and when you talk about the safe zone or like the sacrifice zones, this is a new a new term to me, but it's probably a concept I'm familiar with, because the water there's like, it's not drinkable. We don't drink the water. It's just a known fact there. The right to basic to water is a human right, but there are other things like just healthcare. It was just so normal growing up that we had asthma or we had some form of respiratory illnesses. And I think it's really important for the people, the policymakers who are implementing the just energy transition and the investment plan, to actually like look at this report and see what civil society is saying, because if they overlook who gets affected, that there's a disproportionate burden, that if they overlook that inequality and the state of affairs in Witbank outside of it being a money-making, a way to make money through selling coal, but if they actually look at the human rights and how it impacts them, we could actually start to come up with policy that goes beyond the normal way of thinking, the status quo that somebody has to suffer. Like, it's that scarcity mentality that it can only be one. There's that competitive, and unfortunately, the most marginalized people who have been the same marginalized people for many, many years, for many generations, continue to bear that burden. And I know it's a little bit, cheesy, because people talk about Ubuntu and like not actually implement it, but just as like, corporates, to show that actually we do care. But if you actually foreground it and remember that it's not me versus that person, one versus the other, but that I am because someone else is. I can have my rights to basic to water because like people in Witbank are suffering from it. When you start thinking of society in that way, we realize maybe we should be thinking like how we respond, how we do our adaptation, our mitigation will be better foregrounded in like something beyond the scarcity mindset that we find ourselves in, that creates these sacrifice zones, which is a very upsetting thing, but an important term, and I will definitely be using that moving forward.
Yeah, I'm just thinking as Tsidi is talking that, the WHO has this framework on how to on adapting health facilities and health systems to meet climate change. And the first thing that is said there is that it speaks to leadership and governance. And the first thing that says is that there needs to be political will in order for this to happen. In order for us to be able to adapt, in order for us to be able to mitigate these risks, there needs to be political will. Without that, we cannot do anything. And as Tsidi is talking, I'm just thinking that there is absolutely no political will. Even if you look at the judgments that we've had on environmental rights and climate change, the reaction of the government to those court judgments has been so poor. There was the Earthlives case that spoke to coal-fired power plants, and making sure that in reviewing that, in the environmental reviews, that the climate change is considered in that. And the department involved there basically said that actually the use of coal outweighs the risks that come with climate change. That was the end game. That was the end goal. Or the conclusion that they came to. That speaks to political will. That speaks to the inability or unwillingness to see the impact that this is having. Not even that they don't know. It's now they know and they don't want to do anything about it. If we look at the deadly air case again, this case spoke to vulnerable groups, vulnerable people, those people that are being sacrificed while we enjoy electricity. That case spoke to that aspect, and still the government opposed that case and did very little to implement the declarations that the court made there. So if we're looking at how we're going to do this, how we're going to end up where we need to be, I think where we need to start is looking at our leaders and asking the questions that Mobilize has been asking the political parties. What is your plan when it comes to climate change, and ensuring that there is that political will, because this is a very imminent danger that we're facing, and it seems that there's just no will to move forward on it.
Kanyisa has wrapped it up brilliantly.
Cool. No, I would agree with that. I think with both of you guys, what you were saying there, it's just, it speaks, I think, to the heart of what this report's about. And there was one specific line you used, Tidi, which I wrote down, which was that somebody doesn't have to suffer. What you didn't say, which I then added to that, was, but if we don't think about it or do anything about it, people will. And this is really what a just transition is about, is we can say whatever we want, we can go and have all protocols observed, we can acknowledge that people will suffer if we don't do something, but then we actually have to do something. And I think it's a really good starting point for anyone who wants to understand this crisis and understand the impact it has on people and their lives to put in the time to read through this report or to engage in the report. But I think that leads to the sort of last question I want to ask, and I think I'll start with you, Mo. But then let's go around the room, is what now? So you guys have spent months, maybe even more than a year? How long have you spent?
I think it's about 8 months.
So you guys have spent 8 months writing this report, but it doesn't just end up in the bottom of a drawer now. What now? Where do we go from here?
So I think the next step really with this report is, one, it's intended for members of the public to, as you were alluding to, Dave, members of the public to engage with and to really get familiar with what the issue is and what the impacts are. But from a strategy perspective, what we're looking to do with this is really to start engaging with decision makers around the report, speaking to issues around, how do they adapt either the health or education system, and the specific proposals that we're making, that we're collaborating with civil society partners on. So really the road doesn't end here in terms of this work. We're still going to be doing quite a lot of campaigning around it, and so all your listeners and viewers, we urge to support those campaigns that will surely be on social media and other platforms. So moving forward, again, it's engaging with the budgeting aspects, or speaking to Treasury, speaking to officials within the Department of Basic Education, speaking to officials within the Department of Health on really safeguarding our systems and ensuring that people's rights are protected.
Go ahead, Siri.
I think, Mo has definitely covered the strategic part and call to action, but maybe to also extend it for listeners to know that I think you also mentioned, Mo, about the climate bill hasn't been signed yet. So for people to just keep up to date with that, keep up to date with the just transition, because that's happening right now. They're doing consultations in the coal belt. So, for people to really participate, I'm not exactly sure who the audience is, if there's someone in the coal belt or specifically from Woodbank, I'm talking to you, if you could just be there in the processes and highlight these things, because yes, especially with the economic side, the finance stuff, the numbers scare people, or it gets a bit complicated, or people don't feel like they don't know enough about the inflation side or inflationary effects. But this is your lived experience, and as long as you care about yourself and the next generation and the people in your community, you might as well just raise your voice. So also with Parliament submissions, if there are any bills or anything that's done, just call on people to engage with Parliament. This democracy, yes, the country we live in, it's not perfect, but that democracy and those participation, that public participation was a hard-won freedom, and we as people can use that, can wield that to try and create a country or try and actually create a transition that is just, that we can look back and be like, you know what, I actually tried my best. So those are some ways that people can also get involved.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Moteo and CD have said. And also just to say, at Section 27, we work with partners. We try to, especially in this work, get as much of the word out there as possible. In the work that we've been doing, for example, with WITS RHI, we've learned quite a bit about what are the small changes that you can make in your own household that would mitigate or adapt your environment for climate change. So, for example, just painting your roof white actually decreases the heat that is transferred into your house. Making sure that there's adequate ventilation also assists. So things like that, and so we're partnering and looking to partner with people so that we can get these teachings out there to assist as many people as we can in doing the things that they can do to make sure that people aren't dying of heat stroke when they could have made just small changes to their everydays.
Thanks so much, guys. I think we're going to be wrapping it up there, but as Mo said, the road doesn't end here, and I'm going to be a little bit cheeky and say we've got to mobilize. We've got to. That's what we've got to do next. In all the different circles we work in, with all the partners we work with, but it's really, this is such an awesome foundational document and foundational process you guys engaged in, and I'm really, really excited to see how you guys continue with this work, and excited to work with you guys on it.
So are we.
Awesome. All right. And to our viewers, thank you so much for listening to this podcast from Mobilize. If you want to hear more of these things, you can always subscribe to all our social media channels, which will be linked in the description below. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Bye.